The summer sky over Italy, in 1944, burned with a clarity that made everything visible for miles. The kind of perfect weather that meant bombers could find their targets and fighters could see their enemies approaching from any direction. Lieutenant James Carter sat in the cockpit of his B-51 Mustang, call sign Red 6. Watching the formation of B-57 bombers, they were escorting lumber through the thin air at 23,000 feet. He was 24 years old, born in Mississippi, to sharecropper parents who had sacrificed everything to ensure their son received an education that might lift him beyond the brutal economics of tenant farming. Carter had attended Tuskegee Institute on scholarship, studying engineering with the kind of focused intensity that came from understanding education was not just opportunity, but survival. When the Army Air Forces opened training to Negro pilots at Tuskegee, Carter had been among the first to volunteer, driven by a desire to prove that black men could fly and fight as well as anyone, despite the nation's insistence otherwise. His training had been rigorous and his performance exemplary, but acceptance into the pilot program had been only the beginning of battles fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. The 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Red Tails for the distinctive paint on their aircraft, had arrived in Italy in February and had been flying combat missions for 4 months. They had compiled a remarkable record escorting bombers deep into German territory, protecting the heavy aircraft from Luftwaffe fighters, with a success rate that exceeded most white units. Yet their accomplishments were consistently minimized or ignored by military leadership that could not reconcile exceptional performance with racist assumptions about black capability and courage. Carter had shot down 3 enemy aircraft in previous engagements, his kill markings painted carefully on the fuselage of his Mustang, but he remained hungry for validation that transcended the narrow world of his squadron and reached the broader military establishment that still questioned whether Negro pilots belonged in combat roles. He flew with a precision that bordered on perfectionism, understanding that mistakes made by white pilots were attributed to individual error, while mistakes by black pilots were used as evidence of racial inferiority. The pressure was constant and crushing, but Carter and his fellow Tuskegee airmen bore it with a dignity that made their detractors' prejudice look small and petty by comparison. The mission that day was supposed to be routine escort B-17 to their target near Munich, protect them during the bombing run, and guide them safely back to Italian airspace. German fighter resistance had been light recently. The Luftwaffe, depleted by months of attrition and struggling to maintain effective opposition against the Allied air campaign. Carter flew on the formation's right flank, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for threats, his hands resting lightly on the controls with the easy confidence of a pilot who had mastered his machine. The Mustang responded to his touch like an extension of his own body, banking and climbing, with a grace that made flight seem effortless rather than the product of tremendous engineering and power. Below, the Alps stretched across the landscape in jagged peaks that could kill a pilot as easily as enemy fire if engine failure forced a landing in that unforgiving terrain. Carter noted the landmarks as they passed, maintaining awareness of position and altitude and fuel levels, with the methodical attention to detail that kept pilots alive in an environment where small mistakes compounded into fatal consequences. The anti-aircraft fire came without warning, black puffs of flak erupting among the bomber formation with deadly accuracy that suggested German radar had tracked them more effectively than intelligence had predicted. Carter watched several bombers take hits, one trailing smoke as it struggled to maintain altitude, another with part of its wings shot away, but somehow still flying. His Mustang shuddered as shrapnel from a near miss punctured his fuel tank, the gauge immediately showing rapid loss of aviation gas that would leave him unable to reach their home base. Training took over as Carter assessed damage and options, calculating that he had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time before his engine quit entirely. He could not make it back to the main airfield but might reach one of the forward bases that dotted Italy as the Allies pushed north. He broke formation and descended, his wingman staying close to escort him down in case German fighters spotted a damaged aircraft and tried to finish what the flak had started. The landscape rose to meet him as he descended below 10,000 feet, the details of villages and roads becoming distinct. And Carter spotted an Allied airstrip near the town of Foggia that appeared to have a runway long enough to accommodate his damaged fighter. The landing was harder than Carter would have preferred, his damaged aircraft responding sluggishly to controls, and the engine coughing ominously as fuel pressure dropped toward zero. He touched down with a jolt that compressed his spine and set the Mustang bouncing down the rough runway, finally rolling to a stop near a cluster of maintenance buildings and parked vehicles. Ground crew rushed toward his aircraft, assuming from the damage that the pilot might be injured and need immediate medical attention. Carter popped the canopy and stood up in the cockpit, pulling off his helmet and oxygen mask, revealing his face to the assembled personnel who had expected to see one of the white pilots that comprised the vast majority of American airmen. The reaction was immediate and familiar, a moment of surprise, followed by studied disinterest from some, open hostility from others, and uncomfortable uncertainty from those who opposed segregation in principle but had never actually interacted with a Negro officer as an equal. Carter climbed down from his aircraft with deliberate dignity, surveying the damage to his fuel tank and calculating how long repairs might take before he could return to his squadron. The forward airbase at Foggia served multiple functions, including as a temporary holding facility for captured German pilots awaiting transport to permanent prisoner of war camps. A dozen Luftwaffe officers were housed in a secured building adjacent to the runway, their treatment generally professional and consistent with Geneva Convention requirements. These were not ordinary prisoners, but fellow pilots whose understanding of aerial combat created a strange fraternity that transcended national allegiances. American pilots often spoke with German captives about tactics and aircraft performance, comparing notes with the same enthusiasm that aviation enthusiasts might discuss technical specifications. When word spread that a damaged 51 had made an emergency landing, several German officers requested permission to view the aircraft, their professional curiosity about American fighters genuine despite their prisoner status. The American guards granted the request, seeing no harm in allowing captured pilots to examine the plane from a respectful distance. When the German officers emerged from their building and approached the damaged Mustang, they expected to see a white American pilot supervising repairs. What they saw instead was Lieutenant James Carter standing beside his aircraft, and their reaction revealed the depth of Nazi ideology's poison. The laughter began as a low chuckle from one officer and spread quickly to the others, contemptuous amusement that required no translation to understand. The German pilots made comments in their own language, punctuated by gestures toward Carter that needed no interpretation, their mockery rooted in beliefs about racial hierarchy that Nazi propaganda had reinforced but not created. One officer, a major with an iron cross visible on his uniform, approached closer and spoke in heavily accented English, his words dripping with disdain. He expressed theatrical surprise that America had become so desperate for pilots that they were now allowing their aircraft to be flown by people he described with epithets that reduced Carter's humanity to nothing more than skin color. The other German officers laughed harder, emboldened by their comrades' mockery, treating Carter's presence as evidence of American weakness rather than progress. They suggested that Germany's defeat of such opponents was inevitable, that a nation reduced to arming inferior races had already lost the war regardless of how many battles it might win. The American guards shifted uncomfortably, some looking away in embarrassment, others allowing small smirks that suggested agreement with the sentiments, if not the explicit expression. James Carter stood absolutely still as the mockery washed over him, his face revealing nothing of the rage that burned in his chest like physical fire. He had endured such treatment his entire life, from white students at Tuskegee, who resented the presence of Negro cadets, from townspeople in Alabama, who made clear that education did not change his fundamental status in their eyes, from fellow soldiers who questioned his right to wear the uniform and fly aircraft they considered reserved for white men. The German officer's laughter was simply a new accent on familiar prejudice, enemy combatants, expressing sentiments that differed only in honesty from the more coded racism Carter faced from his own countrymen. But the context made this mockery cut deeper These were defeated men, prisoners whose air force had been systematically destroyed by the very American pilots they now mocked, and yet they felt entitled to judge Carter as inferior. The irony would have been amusing if it had not been so profoundly enraging. Carter looked directly at the German major, meeting his eyes with a level gaze that communicated more than words could convey, then turned back to his aircraft without responding to the taunts. Silence, he had learned, was sometimes the most powerful response to hatred that sought to provoke reaction. The repairs to Carter's Mustang took most of the afternoon, mechanics working to patch the damaged fuel tank and ensure the aircraft could safely make the flight back to the 332's main airbase. Carter supervised the work with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything, checking connections and testing systems with hands-on involvement that went beyond what most officers would consider appropriate for someone of his rank. But Carter had learned early that his survival depended on thorough knowledge of every system in his aircraft, that he could not afford the luxury of trusting others to maintain standards when failure would be attributed to his race rather than individual mechanics' competence. As evening fell and the repairs neared completion, he prepared for the short flight back to his squadron, eager to leave this place where German prisoners felt comfortable mocking him, while American guards did nothing to intervene. The base commander, a colonel who had watched the earlier incident with visible discomfort, approached Carter to apologize for the German officer's behavior and the guards' failure to shut it down immediately. Carter accepted the apology with polite formality that communicated exactly how little such words meant without accompanying action, then climbed into his cockpit and took off into the gathering darkness. The debriefing that night at the 332's base was routine, Carter reporting his aircraft damage and emergency landing with the factual precision expected of combat pilots. He did not mention the German prisoner's mockery, seeing no point in discussing an incident that would change nothing and might make his commanders uncomfortable without producing any meaningful response. His squadron mates asked if he was all right, their concern rooted in genuine friendship and shared understanding of what they all faced as black men fighting a war against fascism abroad while confronting racism at home. Carter assured them he was fine, channeling his anger into productive focus on the next day's mission rather than allowing it to consume him with bitterness. He cleaned his service pistol with methodical care, checked his flight gear with thorough attention to detail, and reviewed intelligence briefings about expected German fighter activity in the sectors they would be patrolling. Sleep came eventually, though his dreams were troubled by images of laughing faces and the burning need to prove himself in ways he resented having to prove simply because his skin was darker than the arbitrary standard that defined acceptability in America's eyes. The morning briefing revealed that the day's mission would be different from their usual bomber escort duties. Allied intelligence had identified a major German fighter formation assembling near Stuttgart, apparently preparing for a concentrated attack on American bombers heading to industrial targets in southern Germany. The 332 fighter group was tasked with intercepting this threat, engaging the enemy fighters before they could reach the bomber formations. It was the kind of pure, air-to-air combat mission that pilots both dreaded and craved maximum danger, but also maximum opportunity for those with skill and luck to prove their worth in direct confrontation. Carter felt something settle in his chest as he absorbed the mission parameters, a cold clarity that pushed aside every other consideration except the immediate task ahead. This was the opportunity he needed, the chance to demonstrate capabilities that transcended any racist's ability to dismiss or diminish. He checked his ammunition loads personally, ensuring each belt of .50 caliber rounds fed smoothly into his Mustang's 6-wing mounted machine guns, then performed his pre-flight inspection with a thoroughness that made his crew chief smile and shake his head at the young lieutenant's excessive caution. The flight to the intercept point took 90 minutes. 16 Mustangs from the 332 squadron flying in tight formation through morning sun that made visibility perfect and combat inevitable. Carter flew as element leader, responsible for his wingman and for maintaining position within the larger formation. His hands were steady on the controls, his breathing deep and regular, despite the adrenaline that made his senses sharp and time seem to slow. They spotted the German formation at 10 o'clock, and slightly below their altitude, more than 30 fighters. A mixture of Messerschmitt Befehl 109 Segundo and Focke-Wulf 190 Segundo, both types fast and deadly when flown by experienced pilots. The German aircraft were painted in various camouflage schemes, some bearing the yellow markings of veteran units, others showing the scars of previous combat. The 330,000 squadron leader called the tally and ordered the attack, and 16 red-tailed Mustangs dove toward the enemy formation with engines screaming and guns charging. Carter picked his target, a Biffy 109, on the enemy formation's left flank, and committed to the attack with total focus that eliminated everything except the geometry of interception and the split-second timing required for successful engagement. The first German fighter fell to Carter's guns before its pilot fully registered the threat. 6 streams of 50 caliber fire converging on the Messerschmitt's engine and cockpit with devastating effect. The enemy aircraft shuddered and began trailing smoke, then rolled into an uncontrolled spin that would end in ground impact. Carter did not watch it fall, already turning toward his next target, his tactical awareness processing multiple threats and opportunities simultaneously. A Focke-Wulf tried to get on his tail, but Carter broke hard left and climbed, reversing the geometry and putting himself behind the German fighter that had tried to kill him. His second burst was shorter and more precise, walking rounds from the FW 190's tail forward until they shattered the canopy and silenced the aircraft. The radio filled with urgent calls as the engagement devolved into individual dogfights. 16 against 30-plus odds that should have favored the Germans, but failed to account for the superior training and motivation of the Tuskegee Airmen, who had been told their entire lives they were inferior and had dedicated themselves to proving that lie wrong through superior performance. Carter's third and fourth kills came within 60 seconds of each other. Both Bf 109 Segundo that made the mistake of engaging in turning fights with a Mustang pilot who understood his aircraft's capabilities intimately and exploited every advantage with ruthless efficiency. His ammunition counters showed he was burning through rounds faster than sustainable, but Carter maintained his aggressive posture, pressing attacks that forced German pilots into defensive reactions that exposed them to his guns. His fifth kill was a deflection shot that required leading the target by impossible distances, his intuitive grasp of relative motion allowing him to place bullets where the enemy aircraft would be rather than where it currently was. The Messerschmitt flew directly into Carter's stream of fire and disintegrated, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away in different directions. The sky was filled with smoke trails and falling aircraft, some trailing parachutes as pilots abandoned their doomed machines, others simply plummeting toward Earth, as testimony to the violence humans could inflict upon one another when organized into opposing forces and given permission to kill. The German formation broke under the sustained assault, individual fighters scattering in all directions as their tactical cohesion collapsed. Carter pursued a Focke-Wulf that was attempting to flee toward German-held territory, his Mustang's superior speed allowing him to close the distance despite the enemy pilot's desperate evasive maneuvers. His sixth kill came after a chase that lasted nearly 3 minutes, the German pilot skilled enough to delay the inevitable, but not skilled enough to escape it. Carter's guns fell silent after that kill, his ammunition exhausted, but he remained in the fight, using his presence to disrupt German attacks on other Mustangs and drawing fire that might otherwise have downed his squadron mates. The engagement lasted 18 minutes from first contact to final German withdrawal, though Carter would remember it as simultaneously longer and shorter than any objective measurement could capture. When the remaining German fighters finally disengaged and fled east, Carter took stock of his squadron and was relieved to find all 16 Mustangs still airborne, though several were damaged and one pilot was wounded but conscious and able to fly. The flight back to base was subdued despite their victory, the adrenaline crash leaving pilots exhausted and shaking with delayed reaction to how close death had come. Carter's hands trembled on the controls, his body finally processing the combat stress he had pushed aside during the engagement. He radioed his confirmed kills and waited for squadron leader confirmation, uncertain whether the chaos of combat had distorted his memory of how many aircraft he had actually destroyed. The squadron leader's response came with an undertone of awe. Preliminary tallies suggested Carter had personally shot down 6 confirmed enemy aircraft, with 3 more probable kills being investigated based on other pilots' observations. Carter absorbed this information with stunned disbelief, understanding that 6 kills in a single engagement was exceptional by any standard and would rank among the finest individual performances of the air war. But as his squadron began discussing the battle over the radio, other pilots confirmed additional observations, their testimonies pushing Carter's total higher as they described kills they had witnessed during the chaotic engagement. By the time the Mustangs touched down at their home base, the consensus was that Lieutenant James Carter had shot down at least 10 enemy aircraft, and possibly as many as 12, a number so extraordinary that it would require extensive verification before being officially credited. The debriefing lasted 3 hours as intelligence officers meticulously reconstructed the engagement from pilot testimonies, gun camera footage, and radio transcripts. Carter answered questions with the same factual precision he brought to everything, describing each attack sequence and the results he had observed. Gun camera analysis confirmed 6 kills beyond any doubt, with strong evidence for an additional 4 and credible claims for 2 more. The final tally that emerged from the investigation was 12 confirmed kills, 12 enemy aircraft destroyed by 1 pilot in 1 engagement, an achievement that placed Carter among the most successful fighter pilots in American military history. The squadron erupted in celebration when the final count was announced, Carter's fellow pilots lifting him onto their shoulders and carrying him from the debriefing room, despite his protests that he had simply done his job. But everyone understood that what Carter had accomplished transcended mere job performance and entered the realm of the extraordinary, proof of skill and courage that could not be dismissed or minimized, regardless how committed someone might be to racist ideology. News of Carter's achievement spread rapidly through military channels, reaching headquarters and generating responses that ranged from genuine admiration to discomfort from officers who preferred not to acknowledge that a Negro pilot had accomplished something most white pilots would never approach. The commanding officer of the 15th Air Force personally called to congratulate Carter and inform him that he was being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the nation's highest military decorations. The publicity value of Carter's accomplishment was immediately recognized by military public relations specialists who saw an opportunity to counter Nazi propaganda about American racial divisions, while also addressing domestic criticism of the segregated military. Photographs were taken, interviews conducted, and Carter found himself transformed overnight from unknown fighter pilot to celebrated ace, whose name appeared in newspapers across the country. The attention was simultaneously validating and uncomfortable. Carter, understanding that his achievement was being weaponized for purposes beyond simple recognition of his performance, that he was expected to be not just an excellent pilot, but a symbol that carried weight he had never asked to bear. The information about Carter's 12 kills eventually reached the forward air base at Fallujah, where he had made his emergency landing 2 days earlier. The base commander ensured that the captured German officers were informed about the black pilot they had mocked, his intention partly educational and partly vindictive. The response from the German prisoners varied. Some dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others fell into sullen silence as they processed information that contradicted their fundamental beliefs about racial capability. The major, who had led the mockery, requested confirmation through Red Cross channels, unable to accept that the pilot he had ridiculed had achieved what few of the Luftwaffe's best had accomplished. When independent verification confirmed Carter's kills, the German officer's reaction revealed the cognitive dissonance that occurred when reality forcibly contradicted ideology. He suggested the Americans must have provided Carter with superior aircraft and easier targets. Anything to avoid acknowledging that skill and courage were distributed without regard to race. But even this desperate rationalization could not fully suppress the uncomfortable recognition that he had laughed at someone who had just proven himself a better pilot than most men he had flown with, that his contempt had been directed at someone whose abilities far exceeded his own. The months following Carter's extraordinary day saw continued combat operations and additional victories, though none approached the concentration of kills he had achieved in that single engagement. He finished the war with 19 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the highest-scoring American aces and the highest-scoring black pilot of World War II. The Distinguished Service Cross was presented in a ceremony attended by senior officers who had previously opposed Negro pilots in combat roles, their presence testament to how exceptional performance could force even committed racists to acknowledge achievement even if they could not fully overcome their prejudice. Carter accepted the decoration with the same quiet dignity he had shown when absorbing German mockery, understanding that medals and recognition did not fundamentally change the racism that permeated American society and military. When reporters asked how it felt to prove his detractors wrong, Carter's response was measured. He suggested he had proven nothing except that individuals should be judged by their capabilities rather than their skin color, and that this truth should have been obvious without requiring exceptional combat performance to establish it. The return to civilian life after the war proved difficult for Carter and many other Tuskegee airmen who had fought fascism abroad only to confront continued racism at home. The skills that made him an exceptional combat pilot had limited applicability in a segregated America, where commercial airlines refused to hire Negro pilots, and opportunities remained constrained by discrimination. Carter returned to Mississippi and attempted to resume the life he had left behind, but the young man who had flown P-50 y Uno Mustangs over Germany could not fit back into the boxes that Southern society constructed for black men. He faced harassment from white supremacists who resented his military service and the recognition it had brought, survived at least one attempted lynching that was thwarted by fellow veterans who stood guard outside his home, and struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The contrast between the respect he had commanded in the cockpit and the contempt he faced in civilian life created a psychological dissonance that many combat veterans experienced, but that was amplified for black veterans who had fought for a country that denied them basic civil rights. Carter eventually moved north to Detroit, finding work in the automotive industry and slowly building a life that honored his service without being defined entirely by it. He married and raised 3 children, teaching them about dignity and perseverance and the importance of excellence in the face of those who would prefer mediocrity as confirmation of their prejudices. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, finding that most people were either uninterested or uncomfortable with stories that complicated their preferred narratives about the war and race. But within the community of Tuskegee Airmen, Carter was recognized as one of the finest pilots the program had produced, his achievements testament to what was possible when capability was given opportunity. The annual reunions of the Red Tails brought together men who had shared experiences that transcended ordinary friendship, who understood without explanation what it meant to fight 2 wars simultaneously and emerge with dignity intact, if not entirely unscathed. Carter attended these gatherings faithfully, drawing strength from men who had walked similar paths and faced similar challenges, their collective presence proof that they had not merely survived, but had excelled in ways that permanently expanded what America understood as possible. The recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen's contributions grew over subsequent decades, as historians reassessed World War II and the Civil Rights Movement forced America to confront its racial history. Carter lived to see President Bill Clinton award the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively in 1998. The ceremony acknowledging both their military achievements and their role in advancing civil rights through their dignified excellence. He was 88 years old by then, his body diminished by age, but his mind sharp and his memories vivid. When reporters asked him to reflect on the day he shot down 12 enemy aircraft and proved the German officer's mockery wrong, Carter's response was characteristically thoughtful. He suggested that proving racists wrong had never been his goal, that he had simply done his duty as a pilot and a soldier, and that if his performance happened to contradict someone's prejudices, that was their problem rather than his accomplishment. He hoped that younger generations would not need to achieve the extraordinary, simply to be recognized as fully human, that the barriers he and his fellow Tuskegee airmen had faced would be dismantled rather than requiring exceptional individuals to scale them repeatedly. James Carter died in 2003, at the age of 83, his passing noted in obituaries that celebrated his status as one of America's greatest fighter aces and one of the Tuskegee Airmen who had changed military history. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including surviving members of the 332 Fighter Group, military officials, and civil rights leaders who recognized Carter's service as part of the broader struggle for equality and justice. The elegies emphasized his courage in combat and his dignity in facing racism, painting him as a hero whose legacy transcended military achievement and spoke to fundamental questions about character and capability. Carter would have been uncomfortable with such elevated language, preferring to be remembered as a pilot who did his job well, rather than as a symbol bearing weight beyond his individual actions. But those who gathered to honor him understood that his life had meaning beyond personal preference, that his 12 kills in a single day had demonstrated truths about human potential that racist ideologies denied, and that his quiet dignity in facing mockery and discrimination had been as courageous as any combat engagement. The P-50E Mustang that Carter flew during his record-breaking day was eventually recovered from storage and restored, its red tail and kill markings meticulously recreated by preservationists who understood the aircraft's historical significance. It was placed on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, positioned prominently among other legendary aircraft from World War II. A plaque beside the restored Mustang tells Carter's story, describing the German officers who mocked him and the 12 kills that answered their contempt more effectively than words ever could. Visitors stopped to read the account and photograph the aircraft, many expressing amazement at the achievement and disgust at the racism Carter faced. The display serves as education and memorial, reminding new generations that excellence has always transcended the artificial categories that prejudice constructs, and that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply demonstrating capabilities that render discrimination obviously absurd. The Mustang stands as testament to James Carter's skill and courage, a physical artifact of the day when one black pilot answered mockery with performance that entered military legend and helped prove that the only thing inferior about segregation was the moral character of those who defended it. The German officers who laughed at Carter that day at Foggia likely never learned the full story of what he accomplished, or how their mockery motivated performance that helped destroy the Air Force they had served. Most returned to Germany after the war and disappeared into civilian life, their prison camp experiences perhaps softened by time into anecdotes shared with family, or forgotten entirely in the rush to rebuild shattered lives and nations. Whether any of them ever reflected on their contempt for the black pilot and recognized how comprehensively he had proven their ideology false remains unknown and ultimately irrelevant. Carter needed no validation from men whose judgment had been revealed as worthless, and their eventual understanding or continued ignorance changed nothing about what he had accomplished or what it meant. The laughter that had echoed across that Italian airbase in June 1944 had been answered definitively, not through angry response or demand for apology, but through demonstration of capabilities that transcended racist assumptions and established truth that required no defense because it was self-evident to anyone willing to see. In the end, James Carter's legacy was not defined by the mockery he endured, but by the excellence he demonstrated, not by the barriers he faced, but by how completely he shattered them, not by the hatred directed at him, but by the dignity with which he responded and the skill that made response unnecessary, because performance spoke louder than prejudice ever could.